Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in 1744 in Frankfurt am Main in the Judengasse quarter. It was a restricted space where the Jewish community lived under constant surveillance and strict rules. After 8 o'clock in the evening, the entrance to the quarter was closed. Living space was insufficient, there were few houses, and families lived in cramped, often semi-basement rooms. His father was a small trader who depended on arbitrary taxes and government permits. From an early age, Mayer saw that social status was determined not by abilities, but by belonging to a community that had no rights. In such a system, any attempt to step outside established boundaries was seen as a threat to the stability of the entire community. Mayer did not have access to universities or government positions. His only path was the antique and coin market. He quickly realized that in the conditions of the ghetto, the most valuable asset was information about where to find goods and how to resell them profitably. He began to study the money market, understanding the real value of metal and changes in exchange rates. This was not just a job, it was a way to gain at least minimal independence from officials. Neighbors watched his activities with suspicion. Any financial success in the ghetto instantly became a reason for rumors. Since the logical reasons for his success were hidden behind his constant work and data collection, people invented simpler explanations, such as magic or outside influence. Mayer did not try to refute these conversations. He realized that the status of a man with secrets provided him with a certain security. People bothered less with the affairs of someone they considered dangerous or connected to incomprehensible forces. This became the basis of his strategy, to minimize open contacts and maximize the use of fear of the unknown to protect his business. Mayer Amschel Rothschild made antique coin trading his profession, but it was only a tool for working with information. Coin trading in the 18th century required knowledge of history, metallurgy, and the economics of different states. He approached this as data analysis. He began to systematize data on the state of the economies of various European principalities. If the coin of a certain ruler became lighter, or the content of precious metals in it decreased, it was a signal of an economic crisis. If new medals or commemorative coins were minted, it indicated political alliances or preparation for conflicts. Mayer kept detailed records of who, when, and how many coins were being purchased. This gave him a complete picture of the financial status of his clients. This work turned him into an unofficial intelligence officer. During his visits to the courts of wealthy collectors, he did not just sell coins, but studied the lifestyle of these people, their debts, and their future plans. He learned to distinguish the true stability of a state from its outward splendor. The ability to estimate the weight of a coin transformed into the ability to assess the risks of lending. This training lasted for years, turning Mayer into an expert in forecasting. His successes aroused interest in the community, but those around him attributed it solely to luck or secret knowledge. In reality, it was routine work on collecting and processing data that no one else had access to. Gradually, he began to independently control the directions of capital flow, staying months ahead of events in the region. This was the moment when the merchant began to build his own financial system, where each coin was only a unit of information in the overall mechanism. Mayer Amschel Rothschild realized that to reach a new level, he needed access to large capital. The richest person in his region was Prince William IX of Hesse. This ruler had a reputation as a man who accumulated vast wealth by renting out his mercenary soldiers to other countries. William was paranoid, stingy, and always looking for ways to multiply his funds without losing control. Mayer studied the prince's habits for a long time. He knew that the prince was fond of collecting coins and began to use this as an excuse for regular visits to the palace. It was a strategic approach. Mayer did not ask for money. He offered services for the appraisal and expansion of the collection, while displaying incredible humility and dedication. Gradually, he became not just a merchant to William, but a trusted specialist in matters that went beyond collecting. William began to entrust Mayer with increasingly complex financial tasks, selling antiques, finding creditors for small deals, and managing correspondence. Mayer became his ears and eyes. He used this access to obtain information about political movements, orders for weapons, and the financial needs of other monarchs. When the prince needed someone who could safely transport funds or negotiate a loan during wartime, Mayer was the only one he trusted. These relationships became the foundation for the future banking house. Mayer realized that monarchs had money, but they often lacked a system for its effective use and protection. He began to use the prince's capital as starting money for his own operations. He would take William's funds, lend them to other individuals at interest, and profit from the difference. To William, he was an executor, but in reality, he was already managing flows of capital that did not belong to him but worked for him. This was the beginning of building a system where he used the resources of the elite while remaining in the shadows. The name Rothschild comes from the sign zum roten Schild, meaning red shield, which hung on the family house in Frankfurt. For Mayer Amschel, this shield became a symbol of isolation. He began to consciously limit the family's circle of communication, believing that any influence from the outside was a threat to the efficiency of his business model. This was not just a desire for privacy, but the beginning of the formation of a rigid, closed caste. Mayer turned his own home into a headquarters. He introduced a strict regime where every member of the family had their own duties, subordinate to one goal: the accumulation of capital and information. He demanded complete loyalty. No secret, no financial operation, not even small details of negotiations could leave the family circle. Such behavior looked strange to neighbors. People saw how the Rothschilds worked from morning until night, how they did not participate in the public life of the quarter, and how they communicated only with each other. This seclusion became the soil for the emergence of the first myths about secret orders. Mayer not only did not deny these rumors, he used them. The family began to practice marriages only between cousins or second cousins, so that wealth would not leave the family line. To the society of that time, this looked like a violation of the natural order, which only fueled suspicions of occultism. They began to be perceived not as ordinary people, but as a separate social group governed by their own laws. Mayer Amschel created a model where the family was both a corporation and a state at the same time. He clearly distinguished between his own people and outsiders. His own people were the family, while outsiders were a source of resources or competitors. Such strict separation allowed him to avoid the mistakes made by other bankers, whose fortunes often disappeared due to strife or poor contacts. He built a foundation that required complete self-sacrifice for the sake of the future of the dynasty. This model became his main invention: not money, but a system where the loyalty of relatives was guaranteed by impeccable discipline and a constant fear of the outside world. Mayer Amschel Rothschild completed the formation of his base in Frankfurt and moved on to the implementation of his main plan, creating an extensive system that would cover the key centers of Europe. He understood that for complete dominance, the family should not remain in one place. He developed the strategy of 5 arrows, according to which each of his 5 sons was to lead a separate branch in a strategically important city. This was a logistical solution aimed at ensuring the family could work in different jurisdictions with different currencies and political regimes, while remaining a single financial entity. The sons were sent to Vienna, Paris, London, Naples, and Frankfurt. This allowed the Rothschilds to react instantly to any changes in European politics. If a crisis arose in one city, the brothers would quickly transfer capital through their network to another, where conditions were more favorable. Such a distribution was an incredible risk. Each son had to be competent enough to act autonomously, and at the same time loyal enough not to deviate from his father's overall plan. Mayer chose a specialization for each one. Nathan, who went to London, was to become the main operator in the government debt market. James, in Paris, was to work with the political elites of France. Salomon, in Vienna, was to provide access to the Austrian court. The distribution of the sons across different countries was perceived by the outside world as an attempt to create a parallel system of power. While most merchant dynasties were limited to one city or country, the Rothschilds became the first structure that had no national borders. For many, this became confirmation that the family was pursuing goals that went far beyond ordinary profit. The brothers themselves understood that this geographical dispersion was their main defense. Even if their assets were seized or destroyed in one country, the rest of the empire continued to function. They acted as a single company, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, using different time zones and political conditions to increase the total capital of the family. When the 5 brothers spread out to the European capitals, a critical question arose: how to transmit information faster than government services? In an era when news was delivered by horse-drawn post, speed was equivalent to power. The Rothschilds built their own secret network of couriers, which worked without days off or interruptions. It was the artery of their empire. To protect the content of their messages, they developed a system of internal ciphers and code names. They did not use open text. In their letters, instead of names or bank titles, they used fictional nicknames, and financial operations were coded through metaphors understood only by family members. Any intercepted letter looked like meaningless correspondence between traders of wool or grain. This system had 2 key advantages. First, it ensured confidentiality. Even if a courier was captured or a letter was intercepted by the authorities, it was impossible to decrypt it without the key. Second, it gave them a time advantage. They received reports on the result of battles, government decisions, or changes in markets 24 to 48 hours earlier than official agencies. In a society where information was the exclusive property of monarchs, the Rothschilds' ability to know the truth before them caused sheer shock. When London or Paris learned about events in another country from the Rothschilds, rather than from ambassadors, it generated a wave of speculation. Contemporaries could not believe that this was the result of only better logistics and strict discipline. Legends that the family had spies among angels or used magic to transmit thoughts began to spread precisely in this period. The Rothschilds did not refute this, because the aura of omniscience was the best tool of influence. People were afraid to quarrel with them, because no one knew exactly what secrets they already held in their hands. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, transporting large sums of gold was a deadly, dangerous, and expensive task. Wars, robbers on the roads, and poor weather conditions made physical transportation of metal a huge risk. The Rothschilds changed the rules of the game by switching to the use of bills of exchange, which are special financial obligations. The essence was simple. A brother in London would issue a paper document according to which his brother in Paris or Vienna undertook to pay the specified amount in local currency. This meant that the actual gold almost never left its safes. It only moved virtually between the branches of the network. This system allowed the transfer of millions in a matter of days, whereas competitors spent weeks transporting physical money chests. Such flexibility created a unique situation. The Rothschilds effectively became a financial intermediary, independent of states. They did not depend on government mints because their bills of exchange became more reliable than many government papers. When governments needed money for war, they turned to the Rothschilds because they were the only ones who could ensure the fast delivery of capital to any point in Europe. For ordinary citizens, this looked like something unnatural. They saw a wealthy family that did not carry caravans of gold with them, but had access to unlimited money in any city. This gave rise to suspicions that the Rothschilds possessed alchemical knowledge or had made a deal with otherworldly forces that allowed them to create money out of thin air. In reality, it was a brilliant but purely mathematical calculation. The rejection of physical gold in favour of paper obligations became the foundation of the modern banking system, and the Rothschilds were the first to feel the power of this change, leaving others far behind. June 1815. The fate of Europe was being decided at Waterloo, where the combined forces of Britain and Prussia were opposing the army of Napoleon. This was a moment of absolute chaos. In London, government representatives and stock market players were in a state of panic, waiting for news. Information about the result of the battle was delivered slowly across the stormy sea, and each day of delay fueled anxiety. Nathan Rothschild had his own system of couriers who were on duty along the route from the battlefield to the British capital. He received word of the victory of Britain over Napoleon 24 hours earlier than the official government. This was the very moment when his informational advantage turned into an unprecedented financial weapon. Nathan came to the London Stock Exchange when the market was depressed by rumours about the probable defeat of the English. He began to demonstratively sell his government bonds. Other players took this as a direct signal that Rothschild, who always knows more than anyone else, possessed information about a catastrophic defeat. Panic gripped the exchange. People began to dump securities for pennies in order to save at least a part of their capital. When the prices of the stocks crashed to almost zero, Nathan secretly bought up everything that was put up for sale through his agents. A day later, when official messengers brought the news about the victory at Waterloo, the value of the papers instantly soared. Rothschild became wealthier than the entire British crown in one day. For contemporaries, this was not just a successful business move, it was a shock. Many could not believe that an ordinary person was capable of winning such colossal sums in a day. From here, a persistent myth was born about the satanic deal of Nathan, who allegedly received knowledge about the result of the battle, not from couriers, but through some mystical channels. This incident forever cemented for the Rothschilds the reputation of those who are capable of manipulating the destinies of empires, receiving profit even from blood on the fields of battle. After the success of Nathan Rothschild in London, when he effectively monopolised the government bond market in one fell swoop, the attitude toward the family changed radically. From successful bankers, they turned into an object of hatred for the financial elite, who lost everything on the very same day that Nathan bought the assets. This was a war in which the main weapon was reputation. Competitors, the old British and European bankers, could not admit their own mistake in calculations or their loss in the speed of data processing. For them, it was psychologically easier to believe that they had lost, not to a human, but to something otherworldly. Pamphlets began to circulate in which the actions of the Rothschilds on the exchange were described as ritual manipulations. The stock market collapse, which they themselves had triggered by their own panic, began to be called a devilish ritual, during which the Rothschilds devoured the fortunes of others. This was a deliberate move. Discrediting became an instrument of competitive struggle. If you cannot defeat a Rothschild in business, you must ensure that others are afraid to work with him. They were labelled as people whose success was based on dishonest methods, conspiracies, and occult knowledge. For example, rumours began to be actively spread that Nathan had a secret room at the stock exchange where he performed strange ceremonies before the start of trading. The Rothschilds chose a position of silence. They understood that any public attempt to justify themselves would only fuel interest in these tales. They accepted the rules of this game. The status of devils made them untouchable to petty intriguers. Most bankers of that time were so afraid of getting involved with the cursed Rothschilds that they simply yielded market territory to them. It was a paradox. In trying to destroy the Rothschilds, their enemies only strengthened their authority, turning the financial institution into a legend that no one wanted to cross without urgent need. After the success at Waterloo, the Rothschilds changed their strategy. They ceased to be merely bankers serving wealthy clients and became the primary creditors of the states themselves. The wars of that time cost huge amounts of money, and the tax systems of monarchies were sluggish. The Rothschilds offered a solution that seemed like a salvation. They began to issue and place government bonds on international markets. The mechanism was simple. The state received the necessary funds immediately, but took on debt obligations in return. The Rothschilds acted as intermediaries who guaranteed payments to investors. Gradually, this turned governments into clients who depended on the financial stability of the Rothschild banking house. Every major European capital began to look toward the Red Shield before declaring war or carrying out a reform. For monarchs, this was convenient, but they quickly realized they had fallen into a trap. As soon as a state became a debtor, it lost part of its sovereignty. The Rothschilds could dictate terms, demand changes in budget policy, or even influence the appointment of key ministers by threatening to stop lending. The political independence of kings began to recede into the background, eclipsed by the financial interests of the bankers. It was precisely in this period that accusations intensified that the Rothschilds were ruling the kings. People saw that after new loans were concluded, government policies changed sharply to those favourable to big capital. Since these processes were hidden from the general public, the people explained this not by economic calculations, but by a secret conspiracy. Theories appeared that the bankers possessed incriminating evidence on every monarch, or controlled them through some secret agreements. This was the first serious wave of theories about a shadow government, which allegedly decides the fates of nations behind the scenes. The Rothschilds did not deny this, as for them, the reputation of those who can stop even an army by their refusal to grant a loan was the best way to guarantee the stability of their own business. In the 19th century, the Rothschilds became some of the largest art collectors in the world. Their estates turned into true museums, where paintings by Renaissance masters, rare sculptures, gold items, and precious stones were kept. However, for the family, art was not just a question of aesthetics or status. It was an extremely effective way of managing assets. In times when banking systems were unstable and currencies could depreciate due to political crises, art acted as a hard currency. A painting by a famous artist or a rare antique had a stable price that was recognized all over the world. The Rothschilds used these collections as highly liquid collateral. If there was a need for an urgent loan, or if it was necessary to guarantee a large deal, they used these objects as security. Moreover, collecting allowed for the legal movement of capital across borders. Moving gold out of a country was often difficult and dangerous due to customs restrictions and state control. Taking out an object of art was much easier. By buying a masterpiece in France, they could sell it to their branch in London or Vienna, thereby effectively transferring huge funds from one balance sheet to another, without unnecessarily attracting the attention of tax officials or intelligence services. Such a model of operation again generated a wave of gossip, since only a narrow circle of people had access to these collections, and the Rothschilds themselves often exhibited art objects as proof of their own higher culture. People began to invent stories that it was in these estates that secret gatherings took place. Since there were many canvases on mythological or biblical themes among the paintings, conspiracy theorists began to interpret these plots as codes or symbols of satanic cults. The Rothschilds used art for the protection and transfer of capital, and society saw in this decorations for the devil. Their collection became an ideal shield. They hid their financial strategy behind a curtain of high art, leaving the public the right to believe in any mysticism they had invented. In the second half of the 19th century, the Rothschilds realized that banking was only one side of the coin. Real power had shifted to the infrastructure sector. Railways became the internet of that time. They connected markets and allowed for the rapid movement of troops, raw materials, and finished products. Whoever controlled the railways controlled the economic life of entire states. The family began investing heavily in the construction of railway networks across Europe, from France to Austria. They did not just lend money, they joined boards of directors, designed routes, and determined which cities would flourish and which would decline. It was a level of influence that allowed them to see the inner workings of each country's industry. They knew how much coal was being extracted, and which factories were operating at full capacity or going bankrupt, long before these reports reached the ministers' desks. When rails appeared, cutting through the land and changing the landscape, it once again sparked a wave of fear and mysticism. Conspiracy theorists began to claim that the Rothschilds were building these paths to bind the world with black magic, or to move forces more quickly for a future global occupation. Every railway accident or train delay was perceived not as a technical issue, but as a sign that the Rothschilds were managing this chaos for their own interests. But for the family, it was a pure calculation of efficiency. Railways allowed them to optimize the delivery of assets, reduce logistics costs, and strengthen the connection between their European branches. They built a system where any country that wanted to trade was forced to play by the rules established by the Rothschilds. This physical control over state infrastructure was much stronger than any credit agreements. They became the owners of the actual paths through which capital moved, and this once again cemented their status as invisible rulers who owned everything, even without holding official titles. At the end of the 19th century, the Rothschilds made their most daring move by turning their attention to oil. At that time, the oil industry was a wild, unpredictable market where chaos reigned. Baku, located on the shores of the Caspian Sea, became the epicenter of an oil rush. Most bankers considered this business too dangerous, but the Rothschilds saw the future of energy in it. They created the Caspian and Black Sea Oil Industry and Trading Society and began to build what no one had done before, an integrated infrastructure. They built pipelines, their own railway for transporting tanker cars, and created a tanker fleet. This allowed them to enter European markets with a price no one could compete with. They effectively broke the Rockefeller monopoly in Europe, making oil an accessible fuel for the entire industry of the continent. It was precisely here that the mythology surrounding the family reached its zenith. Oil, a thick, dark substance emerging directly from the depths of the earth, was, in the eyes of contemporary conspiracy theorists, a metaphor for hell. The fact that the Rothschilds became the main suppliers of this hellish fuel was perceived as direct proof of their deal with dark forces. Each new pipeline stretching across mountains and plains was called the Devil's Red Thread. The popular imagination completed the picture. The Rothschilds were not just extracting a resource, they were sucking out the very blood of the planet to subjugate humanity. Cartoons began appearing in the press of that time, depicting the Rothschilds as demonic figures sitting on mountains of oil barrels, pouring fire across Europe. For the family, this was a period of the highest economic efficiency, but at the same time, a time of the most intense public demonization. They consciously ignored these accusations, understanding that oil was the world's new currency. And while the world feared their demonic essence, they continued to monopolize the energy flows upon which everything depended, from the lighting of cities to the operation of factories. When the Rothschilds began to dominate the oil and railway markets, they faced competition from other major banking houses. However, the methods of struggle they used differed significantly from ordinary business competition. They did not just try to offer better conditions, they tried to make competition impossible. The primary tactic was dumping and informational advantage. The Rothschilds could afford to operate at a loss for a long period to deplete a rival's financial resources. Simultaneously, they used their network of connections to spread rumours among investors about the insolvency of a competitor. Since their word on the market was decisive, even a hint of doubt regarding an opponent's reliability led to a mass exodus of capital from their accounts. They also actively applied political pressure. Having access to government circles through lending to states, they could lobby for laws or concessions that limited the activities of opponents. If a competitor tried to gain access to an important railway hub or oil field, the Rothschilds found a way to block it through government regulations, turning legal procedures into an instrument of business destruction. The combination of financial strength, control over logistics, and political influence made their position impregnable. Any opponent who tried to enter their territory received a blow from which it was impossible to recover. The Rothschilds did not just take away clients, they bought the assets of destroyed competitors for pennies. It was harsh, cold, and absolutely efficient. In the world of bankers of that time, they were feared more than bankruptcy, because it was known that the Rothschilds never played by the rules that left a chance of survival for the enemy. It was this style of ruthless efficiency that again fueled myths that the Rothschilds were not part of human society, but were only using its resources for their own growth. The First World War became the moment when the Rothschilds' global business empire collided with the reality of national division. The family had branches in London, Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt. When countries began to fight each other, each member of the family ended up on different sides of the barricades. This was a huge challenge for their unified management system. They found themselves in a paradoxical situation. How was a family that had always acted as one mechanism supposed to react to a conflict where the victory of one side automatically meant losses for the other? The Rothschilds continued to fulfill their obligations to the British, Austro-Hungarian, and French governments alike. For them, these were primarily clients and counterparties. However, to the public, this looked like the cynical plundering of nations. Governments and patriotic circles in every country began to accuse local Rothschilds of playing a double game. In Britain, they were suspected of secret ties to Germany. In France, of hidden sympathy for Austria. Every step they took was examined under a microscope. It was a period when nationalist propaganda turned the bankers into the main enemies. They were accused of deliberately prolonging the war to obtain even more profit from war loans. This was a time when the old rules of the game, where money has no nationality, ceased to work. the family realized they could no longer remain citizens of the world. Their assets began to be seized, and their names became synonymous with treason. It was then that myths about a devilish conspiracy became extremely dangerous. They were no longer just a way to protect against competitors. They became an ideological weapon used against the Rothschilds themselves. Every attempt they made to remain neutral was interpreted as proof that they were puppet masters controlling the slaughter for their own enrichment, ignoring human casualties. In the 1930s in Germany, anti-Semitic rhetoric turned from marginal theories into official state ideology. The Rothschilds became the main target of Nazi propaganda. Goebbels and his team did not just use old hatred, they systematized all the 19th century myths about devilish bankers who rule the world and implanted them into the consciousness of millions of people through film, radio, and posters. The Nazis created films such as The Rothschilds, where the family was depicted as a hostile force that had insidiously subjugated the financial system of Europe. They claimed that every economic problem in Germany, including hyperinflation and the consequences of the First World War, was a deliberate step by the Rothschilds to destroy the German nation. The family was transformed into an abstract image of an enemy upon whom any failure or social discontent could be blamed. This demonization was not just propaganda, it had a specific goal: the confiscation of assets. Under the pretext of fighting world capital, the Nazis systematically destroyed all of the Rothschilds' business ties in Germany and occupied countries. Art collections, factories, and real estate were all subject to seizure. The family, which had once built a financial empire on the trust of monarchs, found itself in a situation where its name became a death sentence. This was the moment when the Rothschilds finally understood that no economic efficiency or financial power would save them if a political regime decided to make them a sacrificial victim. The Nazis used the myth of the almighty bankers to mobilize the population. It was the most terrible period in their history, when their own business success, their exclusivity and mysteriousness turned against them, becoming evidence of a conspiracy. The Rothschilds survived, but at the cost of losing their European assets entirely and the need to rebuild their lives from scratch, completely changing their strategy of presence in the public space. After the Second World War, the Rothschilds faced the fact that the old model of the Five Arrows, where the family openly owned banks, factories, and railways across Europe, no longer worked. Confiscations, the destruction of assets, and the constant threat from political regimes forced them to change their strategy. They realized that publicity was their main vulnerability. The family began a process of radical decentralization and concealment of ownership. If they were previously known as the owners of large banks, after 1945 they began to transform into a structure where the ultimate beneficiaries were almost impossible to track. They began to mass create complex systems of trusts, holdings, and offshore companies registered in jurisdictions that guaranteed banking secrecy. It was a real disappearance. The Rothschilds gradually moved away from managing large industrial objects. Instead of owning assets directly, they switched to a model of consultants, investment managers, and organizers of large deals. This allowed them to remain at the center of financial flows, but no longer be the face for criticism. Governments now saw not the Rothschilds, but faceless funds, investment groups, or partnerships with neutral names. This transition into the shadows was so successful that many believed the family had completely declined or lost its influence. But this was a delusion. They simply changed their form of ownership from public to private. They ceased to be players visible in the stands and became architects building the rules of the game from behind the scenes. Escaping from publicity became their best investment in security. They stopped being targets for propaganda because the ordinary citizen no longer knew exactly where to look for the Rothschilds in the modern world of large corporations. In the modern world, the wealth of the Rothschilds is no longer measured in tons of gold or the number of shares registered in their names. After a series of upheavals in the 20th century, the family moved to a model where the ownership of assets is completely separated from their management. This is achieved through a complex multi-level structure of trusts and funds. A trust is a legal construction in which the owner or founder transfers property to the management of a trusted person or trustee for the benefit of third parties, known as beneficiaries. In the case of the Rothschilds, these structures are usually registered in offshore jurisdictions that ensure absolute confidentiality. In practice, this system works through several key mechanisms for concealing and protecting capital. The dispersion of rights means that assets formally belong to the fund, not to specific individuals. Since no member of the family acts as an owner in the classical sense, this makes the seizure of property through any lawsuits against an individual impossible. Parallel to this, there is a strict separation of ownership and control. Beneficiaries have the right to receive profit, yet they are deprived of direct influence on the strategic decisions of the fund. Asset management is fully transferred to professional managers, who act exclusively according to strict instructions pre-written in the foundational documents of the trust. The final level of protection is international jurisdiction. Assets can be physically scattered throughout the world, but their management is concentrated in centres with the strictest laws on banking secrecy. This creates a true legal labyrinth in which an external auditor or regulator can practically never see the complete picture of the wealth or establish the ultimate beneficiaries. Today, the Rothschilds do not have a main safe. They have a network of interconnected partnerships, such as the French legal model, which allows separating ownership from authority, transferring real levers of management only to a narrow group of partners with unlimited liability. This makes their empire invisible. When you look at the list of the wealthiest people in the world, you will not find the Rothschilds there. This is not because they have become poor, but because their assets exist in a legal space that does not comply with the standard rules of public companies. They built a system that stays ahead of any legislation on transparency, because formally, the Rothschilds as individuals own a very small share of what they actually control. In the 20th century, and especially with the arrival of the electronics era, the concept of speed changed. The Rothschilds realized that the struggle was no longer about who could deliver a letter faster by horses, but about who would be the first to gain access to analytics that affect share prices. They transformed access to information into their main business asset. How did they work? It was not so much about espionage in a cinematic style, as it was about building the most powerful network of think tanks in Europe. They invested in research companies that were engaged in monitoring markets, raw material extraction, and political risks. This gave them a picture of the world earlier than central banks or ministries of finance could see it. The status of insider activity in the operations of the Rothschilds was based on several key factors that allowed them to act ahead of the market. Political maneuvering was the foundation of their advantage. Thanks to an extensive network of personal connections and their status as the primary creditors of governments, family members received confidential data about changes in tax policy, plans for government spending, or adjustments to interest rates significantly earlier than other market participants. This allowed them to adjust their asset portfolio even before the news officially appeared in the public domain. Analytical anticipation did not consist of trivial information theft, but of a unique ability for synthesis. Where most investors saw only disjointed chaos in reports and news, the Rothschilds, through their system of analytical centers, recognized hidden global trends. They learned to interpret economic indicators faster than others, which allowed them to understand the vector of market development at a stage when the general mass of players saw no changes at all. Financial superiority became the logical consequence of the previous two factors. Having access to forecasts based on exclusive data and deep analytics, they could open positions in the market long before the onset of peak values. When the rest of the players were just starting to react to the situation, the Rothschilds already held golden assets, profiting from the rise or fall of the exchange rate at the very moment when others were only trying to figure out what was happening. This again gave rise to conspiracy theories. People saw that after every major crisis, the Rothschilds did not just survive, but became stronger. Rumors appeared that they themselves provoked these crises, controlled chaos, in order to profit from the fall of the markets. For them, it was simply a high level of business analytics. For those around them, it was proof that they had access to secret knowledge about the future of the economy. They learned to monetize not only their money, but also the ability to predict reality better than anyone else, which in the eyes of ordinary people always bordered on occult foreknowledge of fate. With the appearance of the blockchain and cryptocurrencies in 2009, the financial system encountered something that in its philosophy was the opposite of the Rothschild banking empire. Cryptocurrencies promised decentralization, the absence of intermediaries, and complete transparency of transactions. However, if viewed through the lens of the Rothschild strategy, it becomes obvious. For them, this is not a threat, but a new tool of management. The Rothschilds have always been pioneers of financial innovation. From bills of exchange in the 18th century to government bonds in the 19th, they always sought to control the instruments used by states. Digital assets today are becoming a new battlefield. The influence of financial elites on the sphere of cryptocurrencies has become evident thanks to several strategic aspects that turn innovative technology into a tool controlled by big capital. Control through infrastructure is the key lever. Although the blockchain technology itself is decentralized by nature, the points of entry to it, large exchanges, investment funds, and specialized services for institutional investors, are under the watchful eye of major banking players. These structures, which are historically closely linked to the circle of traditional financial elites, have gradually monopolized access to digital assets, which allows them to influence the market from within. Stablecoins have become a modern technological interpretation of the bills of exchange that the Rothschilds used 2 centuries ago. The pegging of these digital assets to stable fiat currencies allows for the instantaneous transfer of vast capital, ignoring the slow and bureaucratized traditional banking borders. In essence, this is the same mechanics of moving virtual gold between branches, only realized through computer code, which gives the owner of the infrastructure colossal speed and flexibility in asset manipulation. Censorship and regulation have solidified this influence through strategic partnerships with states. The Rothschilds never stood against systemic power. On the contrary, they always integrated into it, becoming its integral part. When governments began to massively implement legislative regulation of cryptocurrencies, large investment structures where the capital of such dynasties is present took on the role of consultants and architects of these rules. This led to the fact that the once free cryptocurrency is gradually transforming into a strictly regulated financial instrument, where the rules of the game are dictated by the same players as they were centuries ago. In conspiracy circles, there is a theory that the invention of Bitcoin was aimed at taking people out of the control of traditional banks, but subsequently it was tamed by those who always controlled money. Are they behind this directly? Most likely, they act through investment holdings that buy up large stakes in exchanges and technology startups. They do not fight with the future of money, they become the architects of this future. For them, cryptocurrencies are just a new level of invisibility, where the movement of capital can be hidden even better than in the system of offshore trusts. After the Second World War, the world changed. National governments became too vulnerable to internal political conflicts, so there was a need to create venues where elites could negotiate outside of official protocols. One of these structures became the Bilderberg Club, founded in 1954, which immediately became an object of attention for conspiracy theorists. The Rothschilds, considering their historical experience, were not accidental guests at such events. Bilderberg is not a government and not a decision-making body. It is a mechanism for the synchronization of interests between big capital, politics, and science. For the Rothschilds, it was the ideal format: private meetings without the press, without transcripts, where it was possible to discuss the strategy of global development for decades ahead. The influence of elite clubs, such as the Bilderberg Group, is considered decisive due to mechanisms that allow aligning global development vectors beyond official state institutions. Agenda setting does not occur through the direct writing of laws, but through the creation of a consensus of elites. Participants in these meetings, politicians, businessmen, and scientists, receive a common vision of priorities. Returning to their countries, they begin to act in one direction, synchronizing the internal policy of states with global strategic interests, which creates an effect of invisible consistency. Ensuring stability is a critical task for big capital, for which wars are a source of unpredictable losses. The Bilderberg format became a tool for preventing uncontrolled conflicts that could threaten the integrity of the global financial system. Thanks to closed negotiations, elites have the opportunity to resolve disputes before they escalate into a phase of open confrontation or financial collapse. A network of loyalty functions as an effective system of personnel selection. People who demonstrate high performance and loyalty to the ideas of the system receive access to colossal resources, intellectual support, and career advancement. This turns them into an integral part of the global network of influence, where the personal success of each participant becomes the key to the stability of the entire structure. This forms an environment in which certain decisions become inevitable, and political leaders choose strategies that are beneficial to the system, not because they were forced to, but because it is part of a consensus of elites. Accusations that they rule the world through Bilderberg are a simplification. In reality, they create an environment in which certain decisions become inevitable. They do not order presidents what to do. They create the conditions, economic, informational, and social, in which politicians simply have no other choice but to follow their strategy. This is a high level of management, where power becomes invisible, and any attempt to criticize these clubs is immediately labeled a crazy conspiracy theory, which only plays into the hands of the system's architects. They hide behind obviousness. While everyone searches for a secret plan, they simply create the reality in which we all live. Philanthropy became the most subtle tool of influence for the Rothschild family in the 20th and 21st centuries. When public criticism became too loud and accusations of exploitation became dangerous, the family began to invest massively in charitable foundations, universities, medicine, and environmental initiatives. Philanthropy for the Rothschilds was never solely an act of mercy. It was always a carefully thought-out strategic move aimed at strengthening the empire and managing public opinion. Changing the discourse is the first line of defense. When a family invests huge sums in cancer research or global projects for forest conservation, public perception instantly changes. The status of devilish bankers dissolves, giving way to the image of saviors of civilization. This is the most effective way to discredit critics. Any remarks regarding methods of capital accumulation in such a context look like attacks on charity. Access to elites becomes a logical continuation of this strategy. Charitable foundations allow for the creation of deep networks of loyalty among leading scientists, doctors, and opinion leaders. By becoming the main sponsors of those who form the modern scientific picture of the world, the family secures for itself an authority that cannot be bought with money alone. They become part of the academic and intellectual establishment, where their role as patrons gives them the status of indispensable partners. Setting priorities through a system of grants is an instrument of invisible management of the future. By financing certain directions and ignoring others, the family can steer scientific and social research into channels that correspond to their long-term business interests. For example, the targeted promotion of a certain model of green energy not only demonstrates concern for the planet, but also simultaneously creates a solvent market for technologies in which their capital has already been invested. Thus, charity turns into an investment that guarantees profit and forms the agenda for future generations. For conspiracy theorists, this humanism is just another mask. They point out that behind every charitable initiative hides an attempt to gain control over social processes. Have the Rothschilds truly become good? This question has no answer, because they have changed the rules of the game. They have learned to monetize even their own benevolence. In the modern world, where reputation is worth more than gold, philanthropy has become the best investment tool for them, guaranteeing them immunity and the opportunity to influence the future of humanity while remaining in the role of benefactors rather than rulers. The Rothschilds always understood that monumental architecture is one of the most powerful tools of psychological influence. In the 19th century, when they bought lands and built estates in England, France, and Austria, they were not just creating comfortable homes. They were building declaration palaces, which were intended to demonstrate to the world that their influence is immutable and eternal. Architecture became a strategic tool of influence for the Rothschilds, turning capital into a visual embodiment of power. Their residences were not just housing, but platforms for cementing status in elite circles. Demonstration of superiority was the main goal of building estates, such as Wadston Manor in England or Château de Ferrières in France. The luxury of these structures often exceeded royal palaces, which sent an unequivocal signal to monarchs and the aristocracy. The family possesses resources unavailable even to ruling dynasties. This was psychological pressure that established them as equals or even superiors to those in power. Creating your own closed world provided the family with a sense of security and complete autonomy. Huge parks, professional security, and complex access systems to their estates separated them from the outside world. In the eyes of the public, these possessions were perceived as cities within a city, shrouded in legends and gossip, ranging from assumptions about large-scale financial conspiracies to fabrications about occult rituals, which only fueled the myth of their exclusivity. The physical presence of power allowed the Rothschilds to literally take root in the landscape of every state where they worked. Through the ownership of real estate, they evolved from visiting bankers into part of the local aristocracy. This entrenchment in the land gave their influence legitimacy and stability, making them part of the social and political elite with which every government had to reckon, regardless of political changes in the country. For conspiracy theorists, these buildings were temples. When they saw complex symbols, coats of arms, or sculptures of mythical creatures on the facades of these palaces, they interpreted this as evidence of secret societies. But for the Rothschilds, it was a purely business approach. Building such objects created an illusion of stability and invincibility. When revolutions and wars raged all around, the Rothschild palaces stood firmly. This convinced clients that money invested in this house was safe. Architecture became for them a fixed asset that guaranteed belief in their dynasty, even when the world around it changed drastically. For centuries, the Rothschilds have faced the wildest accusations, from occultism to the provocation of global catastrophes. Yet the dynasty has almost never gone to court against the authors of these theories. This is not a sign of weakness, but a cold calculation based on an understanding of the psychology of the masses. Silence became an effective tool for protecting confidentiality and business interests. Any lawsuit would automatically give the accusations a public and official status. In court, they would have to release real financial statements, ownership structures, and personal correspondence, which the family avoids above all else, as their influence relies on total opacity. Furthermore, a lawsuit against one conspiracy theorist would only fuel a new wave of gossip, as the audience would perceive an attempt at defense as confirmation that they are hiding something. By ignoring attacks, they reinforce the image of a power that stands above any public bickering or legal disputes. In a world where they have built a brand of unreachable figures in global processes, courts look like an attempt to stoop to the level of ants. This detachment works as a psychological shield. The reputation of a terrifying and all-powerful force makes competitors and politicians treat them with fear, which is beneficial for business. While public attention is focused on discussing mythical rituals or conspiratorial fabrications, the true mechanisms of their influence on financial markets remain unnoticed by researchers. Silence allows them to remain invisible, even while being at the center of global attention. In the year 2026, the Rothschilds' operating model has finally transformed. They are no longer engaged in lending in the classical sense. It is an outdated and risky approach. Today, they act as global architects, consultants, and strategic advisors for the highest echelons of power and big capital. Their business has moved into the sphere of high intellectual transaction support, known as mergers and acquisitions, the restructuring of national debts, and the management of global assets through a network of private partnerships. They do not give money, they design financial reality. When a country or a transnational corporation finds itself in a dead end, they turn to the Rothschilds, not for a loan, but for a rescue plan that guarantees the preservation of the system. This position as an advisor is ideal from a security perspective. If a deal proves successful, the Rothschilds receive their percentage and the client's loyalty. If it leads to a crisis, the politician or manager who signed the documents bears the responsibility, while the advisor formally remains on the sidelines. They have privatized profits, making their actions consulting services that are not subject to the same level of regulation as banking operations. In the year 2026, their influence extends to new critical areas: environmental standards, digital transformation of government services, and energy security. They help shape the rules of the game for new technologies while they are still in their infancy. This allows them to control not the money, but the directions in which that money will be channeled for the next several decades. They have become the invisible intellectual center of a system where financial capital is combined with political strategy. The Rothschilds have ceased to be owners. They have become architects who watch as the system they built continues to work, while they remain in the shadow of their own advice and strategic plans. Summing up our journey, one can say that the story of the Rothschilds is not just a chronicle of successful business, but an evolution of the very concept of power and influence in human society. We have travelled from the era of horse-drawn couriers to the era of algorithms and global trusts. This history demonstrates that in the modern world, power becomes invisible. If it was previously embodied in crowns or bank vaults, today it is dissolved into infrastructure, legal constructions, analytical models, and the ability to form a general consensus among elites. The Rothschilds are no longer just a family of bankers. They are a symbol of how capital can transform into an integral part of global infrastructure that functions regardless of who is at the head of states. They have proven that to achieve dominance, it is not necessary to control the law. It is enough to create a system in which the law and the market work for your interests on their own.